Healing the Ancestors. But before I do that, I'd just like to clarify a couple of points from my talk yesterday. So one of the things I did in the talk yesterday was that I talked about the difference of views in setting up of this retreat. And I think it's really important, I emphasize that I really want to celebrate difference, because I think difference is really vital for the life of the Sangha. And if we hope or imagine that that everyone in the Sangha is going to frame the Dharma and the practices within it in the same way as we do, then unfortunately we're going to probably be in for a bit of shock and disappointment. So for me, I really want to acknowledge that these differences are sometimes, if not always, difficult, but they're really vital and bring life and energy to our Sangha. And we'll only ever know ourselves by finding our boundaries and our edges. And these, inevitably, or maybe, where they become most visible in relation to others is when difference is arising and the edges of our self-view clash and become visible through our differences. So if we remain in some sort of primordial ocean of collusion and non-differentiation, we will never discover what we are or what we're not and what we could be. So I really want us to celebrate the difficulties between us. Now, that's not because I'm perverse, but because I see them as real opportunities to polish the mirror, to step towards those meetings with curiosity, to test, to transform, or simply release from a fixed sense of who we are and who others are. So, in saying this, I'm not suggesting we should be going around actively falling out with each other, but I do really think it's helpful to notice and acknowledge that when a veil gets activated, we tend to split away from the discomfort. And as I said yesterday, the veils are protectors. So this response on some level is quite natural. But as practitioners within a spiritual community, we're aspiring to align with reality. We're aspiring to not close the net curtains, but to stay in awareness. And this is the basis of the Metta-bhavana. So why wouldn't it be the same in relation to our practice of Sangha? So to help us work with difference, it might be useful to remember that on the second day, I suggested that the method of establishing simultaneous awareness of inner and outer experience is the means to move towards a less dualistic perspective, which naturally opens the heart. And what happens when a veil gets activated is that we tend to split. We'll probably recognize that we tend to blame the other person or the other situation as being the problem. Now, this might be true, but it might also be true that a particular samskara has been activated, and in making the other wrong may simply be a defense mechanism to diminish the apparent threat to our sense of self. And until that projection of blame is gradually withdrawn, we will continue to cycle in these repetition of our samskaras. We'll constantly be reliving and reenacting our patterns. But if we're able to withdraw the projection, we can begin to integrate the defense and remain free in the communication. So this process I'm talking about It's gradual. And as I shared yesterday, sometimes we will get caught, but it's a practice. It's not something we have to be perfect in. And I think it's a really important aspect of Sangha, and to recognize this tendency in our communication with each other. So that was just going back a bit to what we were talking about yesterday. The other thing I'd like to mention, just to come back to very briefly, is that there was quite a lot in, there was a word that came up quite a bit in discussing the talk that I gave yesterday. And the word that came up was vulnerability. And interesting for me, this word didn't quite sit right. I very much appreciated the sentiment, but for me, the term vulnerability, this word, it suggests that somewhere there's a threat. So I'm just left with the question, what is that threat? So I completely get this word, and I have to say I often use it myself, as it does point to something important. But I'm wondering, as a term, if perhaps unveiled, unprotected, or simply open might be a more appropriate or useful term for vulnerability, so that it frees us from this connotation of threat. I'm saying this particularly because we're talking about releasing the veils that bind and blind us. And I want to evoke this sense of joy and freedom that comes from seeing the veils clearly and just seeing them as they are, whilst not being bound by them. So I hope this little reframing of the term vulnerability is just seen as an invitation, a suggestion, and certainly not as a judgment. So that's enough about yesterday's talk. So let's start on today, healing the ancestors. So I'm going to start with a poem. It's called For Nothing is Fixed by James Baldwin. For nothing is fixed forever, forever, forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born. And we are responsible to them, because we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. So yesterday I was talking about the samskaras, the veils that affect how we see and interact with the world and ourselves. And today I want to broaden out how we understand our practice of Sangha by suggesting it's an opportunity to heal our ancestors, because we are the only witnesses they have. They still live in us. Now, this might sound a bit fanciful or new age, and part of me is okay with that. And another part of me knows that it's also important and my responsibility to try to ground this aspiration to heal the ancestors within the practices and the vision of the Dharma, particularly as presented by Sangha. So I'll just tell you where this talk came from. So it's prompted by what's called the Going for Refuge and Prostration practice. And this is not something that we usually offer at our public classes. It's a complex visualization and devotional practice which is offered to those preparing for ordination and practiced within the order. So I'm not going to say a great deal about it. I'm not going to share the practice today, but just to give you an indication of one element to point towards what I want to share. So in the practice, we visualize ourselves sitting before, bowing, prostrating and honoring the great figures, historical and archetypal, who personify or symbolize the living Buddha Dharma. And as we do this, we picture or simply sense our mother and all women on one shoulder and our father and all men at the other. And this lineage of our ancestors and all beings stretching back through time trails behind us, but also they are processing towards this single point, this moment of our current life. So it's as if our practice is the tip of a vast pyramid of conditions created by our ancestors, reaching back down through time and space. And this practice in some ways is an opportunity to recollect with gratitude how all these myriads of lives have created this opportunity, our precious life. So much of what we feel to be us, who we are here and now, is simply the residues of patterns of being that have been passed down from one generation to the next. And these are the samskaras of our ancestral lineage. We each carry within us the records of grief and joy that have been passed on and received from one life to the next, parent to child, parent to child. And we absorb all this blindly, like the air we breathe. It's entered us invisibly. And as I was saying yesterday, much of what we describe as the spiritual life is bringing to light and finding new perspectives to these patterns of being and responding that we've received from the lives of others. We are carrying the sorrows and grief of our ancestors. We are carrying the unrealized hopes and joys of our ancestors. We carry their tragedies, their anxieties, their sensibilities, their longings, and their sources of pleasure, and their patterns of engaging with life, with money, with status and power. What they give to us, they in turn will have received and learnt within their own lives. And sitting here, we might sense this procession of lives coming here, sitting behind us, soaking into our back, the back of the belly, the back of the heart. Our ancestors manifest in our body, how we laugh, how we see, how we breathe, how we know the world. Our ancestors are woven into the very cells of our being as we go for refuge and bow to the Buddha. So welcome to the cremation ground. So this is the place of the coming and going of lives. This is the territory of the ancestors. Sangha talks about a visit to a cremation ground. He says, when you actually visit, as I've done on a number of occasions, a cremation ground, and you look around you, you can't help thinking of all the people who have died and been cremated here. If it's an old cremation ground, the myriads are being cremated there in the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. And if you are very quiet there, and especially if you're on your own, you can feel this sort of vibration, this quiver in the air. You can almost feel the presence of those numberless dead beings pressing all around. There is something there, something left, some trace in the atmosphere, in the psychic atmosphere. One feels, as it were, the hosts of the dead thronging round, even pressing round. So I think it's helpful to notice that we are thronged about by our ancestors. We are bound by these psychic traces, these ancestral samskaras, until we release them by building the capacity to see them blossoming within us and find sufficient space around them to give us choice whether to reenact them or allow them to dissolve, to release them, liberate them back into the open field of awareness. So to help us develop this capacity, it might be helpful to recognize the internal commentary on our life. Whose voice is that? And how many internal family voices are defining or calling for our attention? Can we see, can we notice whose eyes we are seeing through right now? Whose concerns we are trying to appease? Whose life are we living? So this process of recognition and release or acceptance allows us to find our own life, our own voice, our own dance, our own responses, spontaneity and creativity. And this is the joy of the cremation ground, depicted in the figure of Padmasambhava. Again, this is from Sangha, Padmasambhava in the cremation ground. I've amended this quote slightly. He says, here Padmasambhava is depicted as a naked yogi. In one hand, a small hand drum rattles, the symbol of fearlessness. This figure drinks wine from a skull cup, symbol of the great bliss. And all around are the darkinis. Some are dancing, some are singing, some flying through the air, some encircled by rainbows. Some are embracing the naked yogi. And the atmosphere of this cremation ground is awe-inspiring and sublime. And the mood of the naked yogi is fearless, face to face with death, face to face with fear, face to face with reality. Human consciousness surrounded by its newly awakened energies. So in this image, it's the wisdom that gives rise to joy, these newly awakened energies represented by the Dakini. And as I said previously, the Dakini, this term, it translates as skywalker, or walker in the sky, walker in space. And these naked figures dance in empty space, rejoicing in complete absence of obstruction. They are unveiled, allowing clarity of knowing, lucidity and complete freedom from the restrictions of the samskaras, giving rise to this wisdom capacity for spontaneity and intuitive responsiveness. So what's the connection between the Dakinis and the healing of the ancestors? So I think the important thing to remember is that all samskaras, these patterns of being that we've received from our ancestors and those we have created since birth, have been formed and passed on to protect us. They've been offered for our survival. Every habit at its root is seeking to protect us in some way. So the samskaras are gifts that we can choose to reenact for our protection, or choose to emerge out of, grow beyond when they're no longer helpful. The ancestral samskaras are the most precious things our ancestors could give us. They wanted us to live, to survive the often difficult conditions that they had traversed. They gave us the best gift that they had, which was their example. And this tender acceptance of the trials of our ancestors might not be a familiar way of describing the samskaras. So a few examples. So one common and maybe familiar form of protection is to keep us small, almost invisible. Or another form is that we may have received is to maintain our position as an outsider. Or to distrust any sense of home. Or we may have been given the gift of feeling we have to discover the unspoken rules of any situation we step into and try to stick to them and play by those rules, or equally fight against them. And all these learnt strategies have been passed on as imperfect gifts to keep us safe. The views and embodied habits we pick up and maintain are there to help us build a sense of stability, of identity, and a place of safety from which to orientate ourselves towards the world. So how do we heal the ancestors through our practice? So every human being wants to embody and live out their potential. And the basis of metta is that we acknowledge our own wishes for well-being, ease and meaning are common to us all. And one of the great delights of working in the Sangha is to witness the way that people coming along seem to relax and become more and more visible in who they are as they engage in meditation, the Dharma and the Sangha. They seem to get energetically brighter and fill out. And this kind of process is always a delight to witness. And on a good day, when I'm trying to extricate myself from a particular pattern, and I'm able to make that shift into a more spacious relationship to the patterns, I feel as if my ancestors, particularly my father and his father, are standing behind me celebrating. If we can accept that whatever we received from our ancestors was meant as protection, can we feel that as we step more fully into our own life, the ancestors will be celebrating? Their work has been done. What needed protection from one life to the next can at last take its place in the world. We step into the world as we are, in our complexity, our ambivalence, our joy and grief, and become visible. And in doing so, in the cremation ground, the ancestors can relax and celebrate. And we can feel that rejoicing coming from the natural world around us, in the movement of wind and water, the sky and dark ditches. We honour them not by reenacting their same constricted patterns and their impact on our formative life, but by stepping beyond them and daring to live our own life. And just as we relax one part of the body, the whole body resonates. So as we step into our own life, it resonates back through time, down through the ancestors. They may become more visible to us. The marking stones and the memories of those innumerable beings, innumerable lives, become luminous just behind us, radiating into us. The patterning from my Father and all men is here, encouraging me towards freedom. The pattern of my mother and all women are here, encouraging me towards freedom. The regret and the confusion, the love and the tenderness is revealed as their lives are still being played out in us. And the practice of Sangha is to reenact, to liberate our ancestors back into this open field of awareness. The practice of Sangha is to liberate our ancestors back into the open field of awareness. The patterns created in us can never be resolved on their own level. If we try to do that, we simply create ever more knotted samskaras. All we can do is welcome the visitation of the samskaras and allow them to release back into the boundless, luminous space of awareness. And as a Sangha, our primary duty to each other is to hold open the field of awareness for each other. We hold this perspective so we don't try fixing samsara. We simply support each other to release from the limited view, to help each other draw open the net curtains that fog our mind and being. And this is the going for refuge in the cremation ground, going for refuge, the open field beyond right and wrong. In the cremation ground, alongside each other, we consciously pick up the ancestors we have carried to this spot and lay them to rest. Release them back to the elements, back into the boundless field of awareness. It might be worth recalling that it's Avalokiteshvara who sees into the nature of Shunyata. It's Avalokiteshvara's recollections that we're reciting in the Heart Sutra. So we honour and release as an act of compassion. Compassion arises as the open heart space meets the ancestral veil. We honour and release our ancestors by acknowledging their gifts, and we release them to join the energy and the spontaneity of the dance of the Darkanese. We take rest in the cremation ground and allow our own being to return into what we describe as the child, to free our own spontaneous play, to relax, to be welcomed home, to live in the shimmering, luminous, vibrant awareness. I'm going to end just briefly with another short story. And this was the story of my mother. So when my mother was about 9, her mother became ill with cancer. So my grandmother became bedridden, and my mum had less and less contact with her. And like any child, my mother wanted to play in the gaze of her mother, just to recount her day and share her excitement of school friendship and sport. But my granddad was protective of his wife and constantly battling with my young child mother to keep her quiet in the house, to stop her playing and keep her away from her own mother so she would not be disturbed as she lay dying. And my mother told me that soon after her mother had died, father and daughter alone, in a fit of rage, he told her that she had killed her mother by making so much noise in the house. And soon after that, he sent her off to boarding school. So she was abandoned to carry that guilt, that burden, which she carried all her life. And the reason I'm telling you this is to show that the pattern that my mother learned was that to be herself with her playful, joyful energy was dangerous. It brought about the death of her mother and banishment from the home. So as I drank from her breast, I swallowed this pattern. This was her own flawed gift of protection, and the terror of abandonment settled into the cells of my being. So now my mother sits behind me and she wills me into my life so that she can live through me. And I try to live my own life to honor the flawed blessings I received from her and all my ancestors, so that they can feel the relief and healing joy of knowing their efforts have borne fruit. What they gave as best they could was good enough, has brought me to this spot, to the heart of the cremation ground, to dance with you. Together we heal our ancestors.